بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي أما بعد. For these last 2 weeks, we've been looking at these verses of nifaq and trying to explore the concept of nifaq that's mentioned in the Quran so much. I'm going to finish up my discussion on the verses today. There's still a lot more to go. So it's Surah At-Tawbah, the section that we're looking at, we covered maybe 6 or 7, maybe 10 verses at most. That section actually goes to almost 30, 40 verses. So we won't be able to cover all of that. Let me finish up one verse that's in line with what we talked about before. So the setting of these verses is the Battle of Tabuk, and we learned that as Rasulullah is trying to muster his troops to go, there are these munafiqeen with weak faith who have different excuses, and they say, we don't want to go, we can't go, give us permission to stay behind. So one of the groups that said this, when they were criticized by Allah for having weak faith, they said, well, okay, if we're not going to go ourselves, at least take our money. Let us pay a little bit of token money to support the troops, and let that suffice. And so Allah, his response that we read last time was, whether you give your money or not, I'm not going to accept it. Why? Because you're fasiq. In your heart, your deeds are unacceptable to me because of who you are. It doesn't matter what you do, if you give money or don't give money, I'm not going to accept it. And then he described what is their fisq. Their beliefs are wrong, their prayers are wrong, their dealings with people, their charity is wrong, everything's wrong about them, and so whatever they do is unacceptable. The conclusion of this, which we didn't get to last time, is فَلَا تُعْجِبْكَ أَمْوَالُهُمْ وَلَا أَوْلَادُهُمْ إِنَّمَا يُرِيدُ اللَّهُ لِيُعَذِّبَهُمْ بِهَا فِي الْحَيَاةِ الدُّنْيَا وَتَزْهَقَ أَنفُسُهُمْ وَهُمْ كَافِرُونَ. All right, so these people, their money is worthless. On one hand, it was their money, their property, their wealth, their farms. These are the things that held them back and prevented them from answering Rasulullah's call. That's one problem with their possessions. These people, their attitude towards their material possessions was that this is primary, this is my priority. To make sure I'm there for harvest, to make sure that my property is safe. When Rasulullah says, no, I need you to come for this campaign, which is of a greater cause, they say, no, we can't because we have our property. So the property that holds you back, the wealth that holds you back from obeying God, there's no good in it. And secondly, even when they want to spend it in the way of Allah, Allah says, I'm not going to accept it from you. Right, so when wealth is like this, when that's your relationship with wealth, then that wealth is useless. So now Allah turns to Rasulullah and says, فَلَا تُعْجِبْكَ أَمْوَالُهُمْ وَلَا أَوْلَادُهُمْ. Their wealth and their children should not cause you any sort of envy or admiration or jealousy. Don't look to their wealth, even if they have more than you, they have a lot of wealth. Don't look to them and say, they have so much, I wish I could also have wealth like they have. What they have, it's all illusion. Right? Because their attitude towards their wealth is corrupted and evil, it's totally useless. So there's no need for you to look at that with any sort of admiration. What does Allah intend to do to these munafiqeen through their wealth? He says, إِنَّمَا يُرِيدُ اللَّهُ لِيُعَذِّبَهُمْ بِهَا فِي الْحَيَاةِ الدُّنْيَا. Allah intends that through their wealth, He wants to punish these people in this life of this world. And then finally, when it's time for them to die, He wants them to die وَتَزْهَقَ أَنفُسُهُمْ وَهُمْ كَافِرُونَ. He wants them to die as kuffar. Now, of course, when Allah wants them to die as kuffar, that doesn't mean He's going to prevent them from becoming faithful. They themselves have corrupted themselves to such an extent. They are those people who are on this path by their own free will. They've chosen a path against God. They have the Prophet guiding them. They have the Quran guiding them. Allah is guiding them in so many ways, but they have blinded themselves. So if they now go to the end of their life and die kafir, it's their own choice that they've chosen to die like this. When it says that Allah wants them to die kafir, that's not His primary will. This is a good tool to learn, because this kind of idea comes repeatedly in the Quran, and it challenges us because we think, oh, it sounds like Allah's forcing them, He's preventing them. طبع الله على قلوبهم ختم الله على قلوبهم طبع على قلوبهم. These kinds of phrases that come in the Quran, their hearts are sealed. Right? Allah sets a seal on their hearts. They have, they're blinded. Summun bukmun umyun. They're blind, deaf, and dumb. All these kinds of verses, they challenge us because it seems like Allah is preventing someone from being able to know the truth, preventing them from being able to understand what guidance is. But we know for sure that's not the case. Allah doesn't prevent people. He wants everyone to be guided, and He provides that guidance, first through our fitrah, then through the prophets and the imams and the books and the guidance that we get through people and through different circumstances of life. There's so much guidance for us to avail ourselves of. If I react to Allah's guidance negatively, when He guides me, I blind myself, I close my eyes and say, I don't want to see it. When I hear the guidance, I close my ears, I say, I don't have time to listen to it, I don't want to listen to it. When I make those choices to shut out Allah's guidance, that's when, as a consequence, as a punishment, a dunyawi punishment, then Allah makes us blind, deaf, and dumb. If I can ask the parents of the kids, please sit with your kids. Kids, you should all be with your parents. Go with your fathers and sit with them, right next to them quietly. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. All right. So one interesting thing about this is it's not talking about the akhirah yet. Of course, in the akhirah they have their own punishment. But what Allah is saying is through their property and their wealth, Allah wants to punish them right here, fil hayat dunya. In the temporal world, He wants to first punish them. Right, so this also tells us about something that comes in the Quran. So what is the difference between us as believers and people who are not believers? Right, sometimes when we look at, we live in a society that is dominated by un-Islamic cultures and religions and ideas. So the vast majority of our co-workers, other students in our institutions and schools, our neighbors are not Muslim. And so we're interacting with them constantly. And then within our family, within our masjid, we have these little bubbles where we have all faithful people, but most of our lives we're living in a mixture where the majority is non-Muslim. And what's the difference between us and them? What's the difference between a believer and a non-believer? Sometimes we look very superficially. We'll have kind of like an equivalence that the most superficial things you'll see around holiday times. Muslims will say, just like you have these holidays in Christmas and Hanukkah or whatever. So we have Ramadan and we have Eid. And it becomes like an equivalency thing. Just like you have a mosque, you have a church, we have a mosque. Just like you have this book, we have this book. And it's kind of it seems like basically there's not much different. It's just a little bit of a different form. That we have a different name for something, you have a different name for something, but then we'll cut to the chase and say that actually there's no difference between us. Now there's a circumstance where it's helpful to say there's very little difference between us, and the Quran says that too. قُلْ يَا أَهْلَ الْكِتَابِ تَعَالَوْا إِلَى كَلِمَةٍ سَوَاءٍ بَيْنَنَا وَبَيْنَكُمْ. Right? So that kind of attitude, it's a good bridge for people to let them know that it's not all that different, Islam. Right? We believe in one God, we want to do good, we want to serve God, and these kinds of things. These are common elements in all faiths, so that Islam doesn't seem like something so strange, it's like such a leap from what they know to be good, that it seems like they'll never get there. It's something that they can never entertain that as some sort of truth. So there's a place for that kind of attitude and that kind of message. But essentially, there is a huge difference, and there should be a huge difference between a believer and a non-believer. So Allah paints a picture in a couple of verses. In one in Surah Taha, He says, وَمَنْ أَعْرَضَ عَنْ ذِكْرِي فَإِنَّ لَهُ مَعِيشَةً ضَنْكًا. For those who turn away from me, who forget me and turn away from my remembrance, I'm going to give them a life that's very constrained and full of stress and full of worry, and a very difficult life right here in the dunya. That's in the dunya. And He said, وَنَحْشُرُهُمْ يَوْمَ الْقِيَامَةِ أَعْمَى. On the day of judgment, they'll be raised blind. And they'll ask Allah on the day of judgment, لِمَ حَشَرْتَنِي أَعْمَى وَقَدْ كُنْتُ بَصِيرًا. Why am I blind in the hereafter when I used to be able to see in my previous life? And Allah will respond, كَذَلِكَ أَتَتْكَ آيَاتُنَا فَنَسِيتَهَا وَكَذَلِكَ الْيَوْمَ تُنْسَى. It's because when my signs were shown to you, you forgot my signs, and now as a consequence, you yourself are going to be forgotten. Because you didn't make a connection with me when you had the chance and you had the choice. Now I'm going to sever my connection with you. I'm going to cut you off. You're going to be forgotten. You're going to be cast into the pits of hell, and no one will ever think of you again. But the point I want to focus on is the ma'ishatan dankan. People who are kafir, who turn away from God, their life in the dunya is a life of misery. The opposite of that, for the believer, He says in Surah Al-Nahl, مَنْ عَمِلَ صَالِحًا مِنْ ذَكَرٍ أَوْ أُنْثَى وَهُوَ مُؤْمِنٌ فَلَنُحْيِيَنَّهُ حَيَاةً طَيِّبَةً. For those who believe and do good, whether they're male or female, then we'll give them a good life right here in the dunya. So He's saying that, but now we have to think, what does that mean in terms of circumstances? Because you look around, if you took did a survey, did some analysis of the lifestyles or the life quality or those kinds of things of Muslims and non-Muslims, you may not find much difference, no statistical difference between the two. The Muslims have this much money per capita, the non-Muslims have this much money per capita, the standard of living is like this, it's like that. There's probably not that much difference that's statistically significant between Muslims and non-Muslims, believers and non-believers. Now, why is Allah saying that there's a difference? He gives people who turn away from Him hard lives, miserable lives, and He gives the believers these outstanding good lives, hayatan tayyibah. The big difference between the believer and the non-believer is exactly in the belief, in the connection with Allah. Once you have that connection with Allah, then He becomes the focus of your entire life. Now everything that happens to you is God-centric. Whatever activities you do, you make sure that they're within the bounds of what pleases Allah. Whatever money you earn, whatever work you do, you make sure it's halal. The halal money that you bring, now you make sure that you spend it in ways that are good and meaningful, that satisfy those things that Allah is pleased with. Whatever enjoyment you have, whatever activities you do, everything you want to make sure that it falls within the bounds of the pleasure of God. Once you make those choices, He brings blessing. He brings barakah into your life. Your life itself is blessed. Your attitude is blessed. Now, even if there's hardship, that hardship for a believer is not misery. The hardship for a believer is an opportunity. A few days ago, we read that one verse where we were talking about the difference between what the munafiqeen kind of have in mind for the believers and what the believers have in mind for the munafiqeen. The munafiqeen, when they're looking at the Prophet's army going to Tabuk, and there are two options, they could either win the battle or lose the battle. Allah characterizes those two things. He says, you munafiqeen, your expectation for us is that we will kind of end up facing ihdal husnayayn. When we said ihdal husnayayn, one of two good outcomes are there for the Muslims. Either they win the battle or they lose the battle. And both are good. So once you do your duty, then whatever the outcome is good for you. The believer has that, he understands that this is, the opportunity was there put in front of me by Allah, the guidance was given to me by Allah. Now I've taken the guidance, I've used my best judgment, and I've made my decision to act in one way or the other based on what I think my duty is. I've done my job. Before Allah, I've done my job. Now the outcome that Allah makes unfold before me as a result of my efforts, whatever happens, it's good, it's best for me. What I thought would be my success in that activity, well, that's clear. If I get that success, then it's very clear, the calculation is very clear that I wanted success and I ended up with the same success that I expected. That's good for me. But even if I fail, for the believer, even the failure, once you've done your job and now it doesn't work out the way you thought it was going to work out, that's also success for you. It may not be pleasant, it may not be easy to understand or those kinds of things, but this is the best thing for you. He's chosen that this would be the outcome of whatever actions you've done, because that's what you've needed. If it's hard, if it's challenging, then it's because he wanted to give you that opportunity to now exercise your patience, to struggle, he wanted to test your connection to Him. That are you only godly and connected to God when things go your way, or even if things don't go your way, do you still maintain your connection to Him and actually maybe even strengthen your connection to Him? Because the believer, when things get hard, they are even more connected to Allah because they know that He's the only one who can solve their problem and get them out of the problem into the solution. So the life of the believer, Allah says it's a haya tayyibah. And the life of the unbeliever is this ma'isha dank. Right? So he characterizes the two lives differently. When objectively, when you look from the outside, maybe you see that they both look the same. The stark difference between them is in things that are not perceptible, but make all the difference in the world. That barakah, the blessing, the direction of the life, the focus of the life, those are things that you may not see from the outside. But the believer who's living that life feels it very distinctly. He has clear direction. He has a clear goal in his life. He has clear parameters for what he does and doesn't do. And he also knows he has the tools to be able to process all the circumstances that come into his life. Everything that comes, he knows how to interpret it, how to understand it in a way that connects him to Allah. That life is a life of ease. Even if it's a hard life, it's still a life of blessing and happiness and connection and spirituality, because he's with Allah throughout his life. And the person who has no faith, who doesn't know Allah, is not connected with any of the guidance that Allah has given, it might look like their life is very good in a worldly sense. There's wealth, they have pleasure, they're able to be successful in different things that they do, but there's no goal for them. There's nothing that's beyond their own self and the dunyawi goals that they have. There's no connection to Allah. There's no reward. There's no blessing in anything that they do. There's no guidance. There's no, they don't know what their goal is in life. And then when things go badly, they have no tools to be able to cope with it, except for maybe mind-numbing tools, right? Substance abuse, or just fooling themselves into kind of different kinds of philosophies to make them feel good about what's happening to them. But it's nothing that actually connects them to anything greater and makes them, makes those troubles meaningful in their life. So the life is completely different, but it takes a little bit of insight, a little bit of wisdom to analyze the two lives and see how different the life of a believer is from the life of a non-believer. Recite salawat ala Muhammad wa alihi. What I want to do for the next 2 days. So Shaykh Faizi has been ill, and so he's asked me to speak until Saturday, inshallah. So Friday, Saturday I have with you. And so what I want to do, there are some questions that have arisen and some things that I wanted to speak about as well with regard to nifaq. So I want to try to address some of these issues in the next couple of lectures. So we've been talking about nifaq as this hypocrisy, this two-facedness. The question that arises is that there are certain practices, certain behaviors within Islam that Muslims are doing or even called to do that also seem to resemble hypocrisy. And so we want to just see, like, what's the difference? Why are we able to do such and such that seems to be two-faced when there's so much criticism for being two-faced and hypocritical? So the first thing I want to look at is taqiyya. Right, so taqiyya is an Islamic defense mechanism. It comes from the same word as muttaqi and taqwa. Right? Wiqaya, waw, qaf, and ya is the root word in Arabic that means to guard yourself, to protect yourself. So when you have taqwa, you have this fear within you that's helping you to guard yourself against those things that are going to lead to God's anger. When Allah says, ittaqu nar, for instance, you're guarding yourself against the fire, of course, by doing righteousness, things that will help you to avoid the fire. So taqiyya is a practice also by which we are protecting ourselves. And this is something that Allah has laid down in the Quran, where He mentions, it's around the time, early Meccan period, where the Muslims who are not under the protection of someone like Abu Talib, who are not part of the Banu Hashim, are subjected to torture by their own family members because they're embarrassed by these young people who are going against their traditions and going against their forefathers and going after this new religion. And so Ammar bin Yasir is the one who is challenged in such a way. He sees his father and mother killed right in front of him by Abu Jahl, and he begins to have fear for his own life too because he knows he's next. And so in that moment of intense fear for his own life, he tells Abu Jahl what he wants to hear. He says, renounce your faith, renounce Muhammad, and Ammar does it. And so he's released, he saves his life, he's released because he gave them what they wanted, but he feels so guilty. He feels like he wasn't as strong as his parents. And so he comes to Rasulullah worried about what's the state of his faith now that he said these words of kufr and recanted his faith. So Rasulullah says, well, is the faith in your heart or not? He says, yes, the faith is still there in my heart. He says, then if they do it again, then you should also do this again. The verse comes in Surah An-Nahl, Man kafara billahi min ba'di imanihi illa man ukriha wa qalbuhu mutma'innun bil iman faman sharaha bil kufri sadran fa'alayhim ghadabu min Allahi wa lahum adhabun azim. So the sentence structure is a little complicated, but the beginning and end is talking about those people who go from faith to kufr, for real. A murtad, an apostate, someone who is a believer, and then he gives in to his doubts and questions and things like that, and he says, I no longer believe in any of this stuff. But in the middle of the verse, he says, illa, except for those people, illa man ukriha, someone who's put into a situation where he's now forced through torture, through threats, or whatever there might be. Illa man ukriha wa qalbuhu mutma'innun bil iman. So he's forced to recant, to say something of kufr, while the faith is firmly in his heart. His heart is still at peace with faith. Right? So this verse then is set down at this time when Ammar has gone through a situation to describe him, but then it sets a precedent as well for us to practice this thing called taqiyya. So taqiyya causes trouble for us because it seems like two-facedness. How can I say that I don't believe when I really do believe? It's almost like nifaq. The munafiq also said he believed when he didn't believe. Here it's the opposite. I'm saying I don't believe, for instance, when I do believe. But there's still an incongruity between my outer and my inner. How is this possible? How is this a good thing? So taqiyya is, like I mentioned, a defense mechanism for the Muslim. When can we invoke it? We invoke it when it's a question of life and death, when your life is in danger, when your safety is in danger, when even your honor is in danger, when your property is in danger. And not only you yourself, but anyone that you're responsible for, any believers, or the deen itself is at stake. So any of these critical things that we have, these are all important things to protect. When it comes to a conflict between protecting these things and paying lip service to some sort of kufr, or some renunciation of faith, or of tashayyu', or even of practices, we're allowed to do that. We're allowed to make that negotiation. Islam is not it's a nuanced religion. When you have conflict between two duties, then we have a system for prioritizing the duty that's more important over the duty that's less important. This is part of Islam itself. The technical term that our fuqaha uses, tazahum. Tazahum is where you have this conflict of two duties. A simple textbook example would be that you're praying your wajib prayer in, say, jama'ah, and a baby comes by and he has a leaking diaper and his najasa gets on the carpet. So now you're faced with two duties. You're in the middle of prayer, you have a wajib prayer to offer, and you have najasa in the masjid, which is wajib on you to purify immediately. Alright, so you have two duties, and you can't do both. While you're praying, you can't go and get water and purify it with all that stuff. So it's one or the other. So now what's the choice that you make? Well, you have to in this case, you prioritize the thing that is more immediate and leave off the thing that has more leeway in terms of time. So while you'll say prayer is more important than najasa and tahara, that's true, but purifying the masjid is an immediate responsibility. I can't say, let me finish the prayer first and then get to it later. If the masjid becomes najas, it's wajib immediately for somebody to step forward and take care of that najasa and get rid of it. That's just one of the rules of a place that's actually a masjid, a shari'i masjid. Right? So your duty then becomes to cut your prayer, break your prayer, and rush to get that najasa out of the carpet of the masjid, because that's an immediate duty. And then you have time. Your prayer is not going to be qada. If you spend 10 minutes to purify and you come back to your prayer, you have plenty of time to pray your prayer. So then you offer your prayer afterwards. So that's an example when you have a conflict of duties. Another example would be, I'm next to some water, a non-mahram woman falls into the water, is drowning. So now I'm faced with two duties. One is to save her life, which is wajib. And one is it's haram to have contact with a non-mahram woman. So two duties. Now how do I juggle that? Well, common sense also says, but Islam also says that saving the life is obviously a priority over worrying about the mahramiyah and touching. So if I have to touch her, see her hair, whatever I have to do to save her life, then that gets sacrificed for the more important duty, which is to save her life. So those are obvious examples, but that same conflict happens with so many different things in life. So with taqiyya, it's the same sort of a thing. You have a duty to believe, and you have a duty to do what's right, but then you also have a duty to protect your life, honor, property, other believers, the deen itself. So these are two duties that sometimes come into conflict. Now we live in a time and a place where we don't face fear ever or very often for the sake of our deen. That's a blessing. We can pray our prayer, do everything that we have to do, have a turba, we can do our wudu the way we do it, we can follow the Ahlul Bayt and our fiqh, and there's no one to say, if you do it like this, I'm going to kill you, if you do it like this, I'm going to beat you up. We don't face that kind of stress where there's a tension for the most part in our lives. But this practice is important to keep alive. Why? Because you don't know when those circumstances will change. Either because you go somewhere else where it's different, or the circumstances change. Things change. Right? Older people lived through 9/11, and in the aftermath of 9/11, there was so much fear in the country against Muslims that maybe for one time in your life you faced circumstances where taqiyya was necessary in certain circumstances. There are two kinds of taqiyya. There's one taqiyya where you actually have fear of death, harm, those kinds of things. There's another kind of taqiyya which we're also called on to do, which is called taqiyyatul mudarah. So taqiyyatul khawf would be the first kind, taqiyyatul mudarah. Mudarah is acting in a kind, gentle way with people to get along with them. Right? That's also something that's very important for us. Right? And so I'll give you an example of taqiyyatul mudarah is probably something more common for us, more applicable to us. Say you have Sunni friends, or non-Shi'i friends, and now you want to pray together. So just to make them more comfortable, say if I'm leading the prayers, and I know there's Sunnis who are following me, so if I have a good relationship with them, they know I'm Shia and everything's clear, then I can just explain to them that, for instance, I'm going to say qunut in the second rak'ah, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. Just let them know, and they'll say fine, and they'll go along with it. Sometimes that happens because you have a good friendship with them. But if you want to make them feel comfortable, you don't want to stress them out, you want them to feel good in their prayer and not feel like it was such a different prayer than they're used to, then you can modify your prayer in a way that aligns with what they're used to. Not because of fear, they're friends, they're not going to do anything. Just for mudarah, just to get along with them, just so they feel comfortable with you. Not, in this case, you don't compromise on wajibs. But there's so many mustahabbat that we practice that they're not used to. I did this in my own wedding, that's one example. In my own wedding, we had a lot of Sunni friends who were there, even Salafi Wahhabi friends who were there. And so I led the prayer, but I was conscious, I know how Sunnis pray because I prayed with them all my life. And so I prayed my prayer in a way that they felt comfortable. For instance, I didn't say the dhikr out loud in ruku, sujood, tashahhud, because they're not used to that. So I kept silent. It's only mustahab to say it out loud as the imam. So I left that out. I said it quietly. All the Shia knew what I was doing too, and the Sunnis felt comfortable. Right? In the adhan and the iqamah, you can, of course, leave out hayya ala ashhadu anna Ali waliullah, for instance, because that's not even part of the adhan or iqamah, but that makes them feel more comfortable. Qunut, you can leave the qunut out if you want. That's also mustahab. So if you think they'll feel uncomfortable, they'll go down to ruku and then see and feel awkward and this and that. So just leave it out, just pray without the qunut to make them feel comfortable. So that kind of taqiyya is also there, and it's highly recommended to do it to make them feel comfortable. And you can think of other examples in your life where you might want to do this. All right, recite wa salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. This taqiyya then is not, it's not two-faced. I'm not doing it for selfish reasons. This is not where you, for instance, you can just lie because there's some selfish reason. I want to get some advantage from you, I want to take something from you and whatever, so I lie so that I can get my way. There's a ticket for children under or over 15, and I lie and say, no, all my children are under 15 when actually they're over 15. But you can't say that's taqiyya, that's just an outright lie. For monetary advantage, that's haram. Even if whoever the ticket vendor is, whoever whatever the venue is, that's haram. You can't lie to get these kinds of advantages. And don't defame taqiyya with your own personal lives. And taqiyya is a noble practice, an Islamic practice, not simply a Shi'i practice, and it's there as a defense for life, property, honor, Islam, and all these things that are sacred. I'll give you one example from the times of the Imams. Many of the Imams lived in times when there was serious fear for their life, the life of their Shia, the safety of their Shia, and for the deen itself. And so they regularly had to negotiate when to use taqiyya and when not to use taqiyya. And it creates quite a challenge for our scholars, because we have ahadith where the Imams will say to do something and it looks just like the way Sunnis do it. And then another hadith that says do something and it's different from how the Sunnis do it. And then the faqih has to see which one's right. If the Imam is saying do it like this and do it like this, and there are two different ways of doing it, how do we sort through and figure out which one is right and which one is done through taqiyya? There's one example that always blows me away, and I think it gives you an idea and an admiration for the ability of the Imams to negotiate taqiyya in a way that's so beautiful and very complex. So the 5th and 6th Imam had a prominent companion named Zurara ibn A'yan. He is responsible for, he and about 4 other companions of the 5th and 6th Imams are responsible for like 70-80% of the ahadith that we have. If it weren't for Zurara, then we wouldn't have any fiqh. So he says, one day I was sitting in the presence of Imam Sadiq alayhi salam. And he says, I asked him a question and he gave me an answer. And then I sat there on the side and some more people came in. So another person came in, asked the same question, and the Imam gave him a different answer from what he gave me. Then that guy left, a third person came in, he also asked the same question, the Imam gave a third answer. So Zurara knew better, he understood that the Imam was using taqiyya. The answer he gave me was the right answer, now he's giving a taqiyya answer to these other people. But his question to the Imam when they leave is, Sayyidi, these are 2 of your Shi'i followers, both from Iraq, both from the same city. And now you've given them both 2 different answers. Now when they go back to their city, what's going to happen? They're both going to go to their people and say, قال الصادق, and give the answer. I heard with my own ears that he said such and such. The other guy said, no, I heard with my own ears that he said such and such. And it's going to be conflict between them and between their tribes and people. And the Shia themselves are going to start fighting because the Imam has given this disinformation. So when Zurara asked, explain the wisdom, why did you just do what you did? Right? Because it's one taqiyya would be enough. You give one right answer to one person when it's safe and you don't see any danger, the person's careful and all of that. If you feel like you need to do taqiyya, then have one standard taqiyya answer that is, is safe. Might be wrong, but it's safe. But the question in this hadith is, why give 2 different answers, both to the same people from the same city, also Shia, also your followers, and it's only going to lead to fitna in that place. The Imam says that if the government sees that my Shia are all unified in their opinion on something, then that will be trouble for the Shia and trouble for me. Everywhere they go, they hear, you're a follower of Ja'far Sadiq and you say the same thing. You're a follower of Ja'far Sadiq, you say the same thing. They're all saying the same thing. That becomes scary for the government that is imagining that the Sadiq is going to now, all he has to do is say one word and he has so many followers who are going to be unified with him. So because that's dangerous for him and dangerous for the Shia and dangerous for the madhab, he says, he plants these seeds of discord amongst the Shia themselves, because better that they be fighting a little bit on minor things amongst themselves, and then the government sees them and says, these people, they can't even handle their own things. They're too busy fighting with themselves, they're no danger to us. And the government feels safe that these people aren't a threat to us. That's a better dynamic for the Shia than for them all to be unified. It's a very complex dynamic, and just to imagine the Imam choreographing all of that and having that kind of strategy, which is, has so many layers to it, really gives you a sense of admiration for his wisdom to be able to think that many steps ahead of the game, to strategize in this way. And it also gives you an appreciation of sometimes this frustration that we sometimes feel as Muslims. So why don't we have our act together better? Why don't we do things better? This and that. Yes, our effort should be towards more education, so everyone's on the same page and we all are submitting to the same laws and these kinds of things. But the reality is, we are not going to ever be unified the way we should be until the Ma'soom himself comes and is able to bring us together and we're able to submit ourselves to him. That's going to happen, inshallah, in the time of Imam al-Hujjah. Alright, so that's a little bit about one aspect. We'll talk about a few other practices or behaviors that Muslims have that seem to be hypocritical or have two faces to them, but they're actually justified, there's a reason for them, and we're allowed to do them, and they're not nifaq, not hypocrisy. Recite salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Any questions? right. Let's rise for the ziyarah. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamu alayka ya Rasulullah. Assalamu ala al-a'immatil hadin al-mahdiyyin. Assalamu ala jami'i anbiya'illahi wa rusulihi wa malaikatihi. Assalamu alayna wa ala ibadillahi as-salihin. Assalamu alaykum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.